I always believed that blood meant something. That family, no matter how flawed, would always stand by you. I spent years helping Grandma. Through her recovery, her loneliness, even the nights she forgot who I was. I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because I loved her. But when she called for a special announcement at dinner, I felt my chest tighten. Everyone was there. My uncle with his arrogant smile, my cousin Daniel, who only showed up for holidays, and me, the quiet shadow at the end of the table. The room fell silent as she opened her wooden chest, the one I remembered from childhood. She smiled, but not at me. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that people don't forget who was there for them when it really mattered. But I was wrong. That night, something was taken from me, not just an object, but a piece of trust I'd held all my life. And so I did the only thing I could. I stood up and showed them all what they had forgotten. The scent of rosemary and roasted lamb filled the house, mingling with the low hum of conversations and the clinking of cutlery as the family settled around the long oak table. It was one of those rare evenings when everyone was present. Cousins from out of town, uncles with receding hairlines and rehearsed jokes, aunts in their best jewelry pretending everything was fine. At the head of the table sat Grandma, her frail hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes flickering between faces with something unreadable behind them. The old chest that once sat untouched in the far corner of the living room had been dusted and moved closer, resting quietly beside her chair. It had been a part of the family for decades, the kind of object that held more than just belongings. It carried history, memory, unspoken promises. Some of the grandchildren whispered about what might be inside, laughing nervously as they filled their plates. But beneath the cheerful noise, a subtle unease pulsed through the room. She had been quieter than usual lately, slower in her steps, forgetful in ways that made some shake their heads and others worry in silence. Still, there was an unspoken belief, especially in him, that when the time came, she would remember who had always been there. He had sat with her through illness, carried her bags at the market, listened when her voice trembled. He didn't need recognition, but he trusted she hadn't forgotten. The meal moved forward with laughter and stories. Yet in the back of his mind, something whispered that this dinner would not end like the others. The clatter of plates and silverware slowly faded as Grandma rose from her chair, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Conversations died mid-sentence, and all eyes turned toward her. The air shifted, becoming denser, heavier with anticipation. Her thin fingers reached for the wooden chest beside her, the same chest that had been the quiet centerpiece of the room all evening. With effort, she opened it, the creak of the hinges echoing louder than expected in the sudden silence. From within, she pulled out a small bundle, papers, envelopes, something wrapped in soft cloth. She looked around the room, her gaze passing over the faces of her family, lingering on each for only a moment. Then, without hesitation, she turned to her grandson Daniel, the cousin who had always hovered on the edges of things. He had never been close to her, rarely visited except on holidays, often excused his absence with the vague promise of being busy. Still, she extended the items toward him with trembling hands, her expression unreadable. A wave of quiet disbelief rippled through the table, quickly replaced by polite nods, forced smiles, and a few congratulatory pats on the back. But not from him. He sat frozen, his thoughts racing, heart heavy with a slow-building ache that settled deep in his chest. He had not expected a grand gesture, not even a speech, but this quiet dismissal, landed like a blow. No words were spoken to explain the decision. There was no acknowledgement of what he had given, no recognition of the time, care, or love he had offered so freely. He looked down at his plate, now cold, untouched, as a numbness began to spread through him. Around him, the room carried on, but in his ears everything was muffled, distant, like the world had shifted slightly and left him behind. After the dinner ended and the dishes were cleared, the house slowly emptied of voices and footsteps, leaving behind a lingering quiet that felt unnatural. He remained behind, helping to carry stray glasses into the kitchen, offering polite nods to those who passed him without meeting his eyes. His chest felt hollow, not with anger, but with a thick, wordless confusion. Something didn't fit. It wasn't about the object, the inheritance, or even the chest. It was about the silence that surrounded it, the way no one questioned the sudden shift, the way Grandma avoided his gaze. He couldn't let it go. Hours later, as the sky darkened and the house settled into stillness, he wandered back into the study. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust, books leaning against one another like tired shoulders. He noticed the desk, a place he had seen her sit many times before, scribbling notes on scraps of paper, sealing small envelopes with her delicate handwriting. One drawer was slightly open. Inside, a pile of letters sat in uneven stacks. Most were addressed to banks or relatives, but near the bottom, his name appeared, faintly written in ink that had started to fade. It wasn't the first time he had seen her handwriting on something personal. He remembered a conversation from months ago, when she had told him she was setting everything in order, just in case. At the time, he hadn't pressed her. Now, with the weight of the evening pressing down on him, he felt compelled to read. He unfolded the letter carefully. Her words spilled across the page in a wavering script, thoughtful and clear, written before her health had truly declined. She spoke of gratitude, of memories, of decisions she wanted to make on her own terms. The letter ended with a quiet declaration, a statement of who she trusted most to carry forward what mattered. It was him. The date was months before Daniel had reappeared. His hands trembled as he folded the letter back along its creases. A knot formed in his stomach, part disbelief, part fury, but mostly sorrow. Something had changed since that letter was written. Something he didn't yet understand. And now, he knew the truth was buried somewhere deeper, and he would not stop until he found it. The next morning, the sky hung low and gray, as if the weight of what had been left unsaid the night before had settled into the air. He arrived early, before most of the family had returned for the informal gathering Grandma had requested. Her reasons were vague, couched in polite words and half-smiles, but he understood now that this was more than a farewell brunch. It was a staging ground, whether she intended it or not. He carried the letter in the inner pocket of his coat, the paper stiff from age but uncreased from care. As the room filled again with familiar voices and the scraping of chairs, the mood was lighter than it had been the night before, as if everyone had moved on. He hadn't. The moment came when Grandma stood to speak, thanking everyone for their presence, gesturing once again toward Daniel with words of pride and affection. A few glanced toward him, perhaps wondering if he would speak, but no one asked. He waited until she sat back down, her eyes warm but distant, and then he rose. The shift in energy was immediate. Conversations quieted, forks paused midair, and a few brows lifted in anticipation. He walked to the front of the room, steady and quiet, and placed the letter on the table between them all. He didn't need to say much. The handwriting was unmistakable. The date, clearly marked in the upper corner, spoke louder than anything he could say. Eyes scanned the page in silence. Someone gasped. Others leaned forward. Grandma's expression changed slowly, the recognition settling in as she read. There was no shouting, no accusations. Just silence. Thick, unmoving silence that filled every corner of the room and stretched the seconds into something longer. Daniel's face turned pale, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. No one came to his defense. The letter had done what his voice never could. It had shown them not just what had been hidden, but what had been ignored. When he stepped back, he no longer felt small. He no longer felt forgotten. In that moment, the truth stood on its own, needing nothing more than to be seen. The living room was brighter that morning, with soft sunlight filtering through the lace curtains, casting fragile patterns on the carpet. The atmosphere had shifted into something more casual, more performative. Family members lingering near coffee cups, chatting in softened tones, smiling as if the weight of the previous evening had been packed away and sealed shut. But for him, the night had never ended. The letter rested in his coat pocket like a heartbeat, pulsing with quiet authority. He stood apart from the others, watching the way Daniel laughed with the older relatives, effortlessly slipping into the role he had been handed, the role that had never truly belonged to him. No one questioned it. They accepted it, welcomed it, allowed it to reshape the story without resistance. He waited until the conversations thinned and attention drifted toward the center of the room, where Grandma had again seated herself in her favorite chair, a blanket neatly folded across her lap. The chest sat beside her once more, now partially closed, as though uncertain of its own place. He moved to the front of the room without urgency, the letter in his hand now, firm and visible. Heads turned slowly, unsure of what he was doing until he laid the letter down on the low table in front of her, in front of all of them. There were no raised voices, no warnings. Just a pause, a breath held across the entire room, as their eyes locked on the delicate handwriting and the familiar signature. He stepped back as they began to read. Some leaned forward, eyes narrowing in disbelief, while others looked to each other for explanation, reassurance, anything. The date on the letter spoke first. It was from a time before illness, before confusion, before decisions could be manipulated or rewritten. The contents were clear and deliberate, naming him as the intended recipient of the chest and everything within it. The room, once filled with soft conversation, fell into complete stillness. Grandma stared at the paper, her eyes slowly darkening, not with denial but with recognition. She knew those words. She had written them in a moment of clarity, long before Daniel had re-entered her life with convenient timing and patient smiles. No one argued. No one moved to protest. Even Daniel stood motionless, the weight of exposure washing over him with silent force. The air felt different now, not hostile but stripped of illusion. The truth had arrived not in anger, but in quiet, undeniable form, and it had settled between them like a long-awaited reckoning. The hours that followed passed in a strange kind of stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Conversations resumed, but they were thinner now, cautious and fragmented, shadows of their earlier ease. No one addressed the letter directly, yet its presence lingered in every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word. Daniel stayed mostly silent, his charm replaced by a stiff, distant calm. He no longer held court in the center of the room. Instead, he drifted along the edges, as if waiting for an exit to open. Eventually, he left without saying goodbye, a nod serving as his only farewell. Grandma remained in her chair, her expression unreadable, her hands folded in her lap like they had been the night before. She didn't ask for the letter back, nor did she offer an explanation. Perhaps she didn't need to. Perhaps she couldn't. For him, the moment did not bring triumph. It brought clarity. There was no satisfaction in proving others wrong, no relief in exposing what had been hidden. The victory, if there was one, came quietly, like exhaling after holding your breath too long. He didn't need the inheritance. He needed to know he hadn't imagined it all, that the hours he spent by her side had meant something, that his presence had been real in her life. That validation came not through words, but through the ink she'd left behind. The chest stayed closed now, untouched by anyone. No one dared to approach it. The room felt quieter without it being the centerpiece of conflict, reduced once again to a piece of furniture holding family secrets. When he finally stepped outside, the air was cool, the sky clear in a way it hadn't been for days. He walked down the familiar path that led away from the house, not looking back. Some truths didn't need to be repeated. They simply needed to be seen once fully, for everything to change.